I'm here at Merida talking to Sheila McNamee, and we're at a conference on enriching practices, collaborative practices across cultural borders. So thank you, Sheila, for having this conversation. And basically, I just wanted to talk about ideas of how inquiry is performance, or how do you view it as performance, and what is performance?
Yeah. Great questions, and thanks for inviting me to have this conversation with you. I guess there's so many ways to come at this, but what I'm thinking about now is the idea of performance being such an important idea in relational, collaborative, constructionist practice. That once we recognize that everything that we do is an invitation to ourselves and to others into the performance, or we could say the creation or construction of a particular understanding, a particular worldview. It gives a different edge to how we come at our lives. So I may not like the performance we're doing now. So then my question to myself could be, what could I do that's different, that might invite a performance that we both like more? When I think about inquiry and research, and when I think about the topic of this conference of crossing cultural borders, we could think of the world of research that is scientific and pure and objective and universal and predictive and controlled and all of those things. Or we could think about research as part of our everyday activity, part of the performances that we engage in as we live our daily lives, and in particular my interest is in as we do our professional work, professional practice. And so I find that it's very liberating to practitioners to talk about inquiry as performance, because it allows them to think of themselves as researchers, which is otherwise such an unattainable goal, because only scientists or social scientists do research.
Because it's in this other category of sacred, special practices.
Yeah. But I'm wondering how you would answer that question.
See, that's interesting, because I've gone away from the question itself, and I'm in this space where you talked about how to move research into the more everyday, ordinary kinds of spaces and conversation. And I am intrigued by this idea of that research as a construct becomes more accessible if you think about it as performance.
Right.
And that's something I think I've not played with that way of thinking. But what that brings to me is this idea of, which I know both of us don't think about this way, but the first idea that pops up when you say performance, people think, oh, it's artificial,
That's
it's
right,
not real, etc., or it's somehow fake.
Yeah.
And so when we're trying to shift research into a more everyday space, or as an everyday activity, by introducing it as a performance, does it really help to do that, or does it distance it even more because of the term performance itself?
Yeah. I think it's problematic, and I have certainly, I could tell lots of stories.
Yeah, I would love to hear stories.
Well, there was a conference that we were all attending, several of us, last year about this time, and both Ken and I were using the word performance, and the audience were mostly Gestalt. And for them, performance is fake, and as opposed to authentic. And we were I thought, very clear in, we're not talking about performance as opposed to an authentic, this is as authentic as it gets.
Right.
We're talking about everyday activities as performances, because it's a liberating metaphor, we think, to use. But anyway, so there was a lot of flack in that. But so it can, I never want to hold on to a term too tightly when it creates that kind of distancing. So if I felt that, and I was trying to encourage practitioners to be able to think of themselves as researchers, and the performance metaphor wasn't useful for them, I might say, can you think of your everyday activities? Can you think of your work as an engaged activity? And the engaged activity is a form of inquiry. Inquiry is always a form of research. Doing an archaeology back to.
Right, yeah. I like that, and I've seen you do that. And I don't know if it's parallel of that, but sometimes depending on the context, I use the word play instead of performance.
Yeah.
And talk about how can we play with the concept or the construct of research.
Right.
And then it's back to that liberating thing. Like, it gives us permission. Oh, I'm just playing. I don't have to be in the special way trained or special way of thinking.
Right.
But the point I'm trying to get them to also kind of acknowledge is that they're already doing those kinds of activities that have special labels in this space that we call research.
Right.
And how can we bridge, talking about bridging cultures, how do we bridge that everyday practice and this sacred space practice?
Right.
So that's how I think about performance sometimes.
Yeah.
I think it's one of those terms that has multiple meanings, and I'm still playing with it, so I like the idea of holding it loosely.
Yeah, and the idea of play, I love to add to that the notion of rigorous play. Because of course in a research world, if you say let's play with the idea of research, people, that's blasphemy.
Right.
This is not playful, this is serious stuff. But play is very serious, and that also then reminds me of someone who has very much influenced my life, which is Gregory Bateson, and his, rigor and imagination. That you need the two together. So,
and I'm also wondering about, for me again, it brings us back into this notion of relational practices and language. That if people are challenged, it creates an opportunity or a possibility to have a conversation about why is this language so problematic, and how come we don't problematize the language of research or fact or science.
Right. It's stepping into that. This is what I have come, it's such an obvious point, but in a sense, if I had to boil everything down to something, this year it would be reflection. Reflexivity. So in the world of traditional research, you're not reflective. Why did you do it this way? Because this is a controlled method, because this is the right statistical test to use, because this is the right instrument. And as I know for both of us, as we work with graduate students, they get a topic. Is this the right question? Should it be different? Is this the right method, or should I do that? And of course, the answer always is, you can use any method you want, but you should be able to justify the choices that you made, and then work from there. So I think, actually I've lost track of the original comment that you made. But
But what we're doing right now is part of it, which is we are creating something, we're trying to create an understanding. And it's this back and forth, and that sometimes it does seem to go off and you're kind of lost what it is. But that comes back to this notion of reflection and reflexivity.
Right, that's the point.
Yeah, which is what are we doing here?
To reflect on, and the other term that comes to mind is deconstruction, that when you invite people to play with the idea of research and what it is and what does that mean and what could it be, you're really inviting people not only into a reflective stance, but that reflective stance is a stance of deconstructing and pulling apart the taken for granted understanding and saying, this is a moment of creativity that could be different. This is how I've been thinking about it. This is how I think most people think about it, but could it be other?
And I think that's so important. You said it's a moment of creativity. It's not creativity just as an artist's creativity, but the creativity of we are creating something in research. It's not that I'm just investigating and describing this glass of water, but in describing it, I'm creating something.
Exactly. So the distinction between discovery and creation. Construction. Other metaphors that I find are useful is, to move away from the archaeological metaphor of like digging, and I'm going to find the truth in there. I'm going to really get the answer to this question, to this social problem, if I have the right method. And here it's sort of like, okay, here's a social problem, a question I have, and I'm curious, how many different ways can we understand this? And what's going to be useful? Okay, that's the other difference, of course, when we talk about research. It's not what's true.
It's what's useful.
What's useful, and for whom is it useful? And it's never going to be useful for everybody. So then that's the next inquiry process, right? Is how do I broaden it to be useful for another population, a different group?
And I think what comes up with these two questions, what's useful and to whom, it's a way of addressing the issue of power that sometimes gets critiqued, that social constructionist or constructionist thinking doesn't address. And I think it does address it in this way, which is by talking about A as a construction, and B talking about who are the people who are constructing, and to whom is it serving, or who is it useful for.
Exactly.
And that for me is where the meaning of performance comes in, or a more critical way of thinking about performance, that it is not just a role, but it is this notion of you are engaging in a reflexive way with these questions present. And so that phenomenon doesn't happen when you're thinking about research as a tradition. And it's more thought about it as an application rather than construction. Though I think it is a construction too there. And there's, I mean, now, you know, you encouraged me to tell a story, so actually that makes me think of one. It's kind of the reverse, but it speaks to the issue of research. So after I finished my PhD, which was on therapeutic process, a colleague who I'd been working, he had been doing his dissertation on a similar topic, and we worked together a lot. He called me up and he said, you know, I know that you really want to be a therapist, not just a researcher of therapeutic process. So I'm inviting you, I'm going to pay you a scholarship to come to my training program. So he called my bluff. I was actually really wanted to explore that world. And the very first night of the training, he said, we have a family just for you. It's a communication problem, that being my discipline. And then he proceeded to describe a very complex family situation, a schizophrenic 21-year-old, a borderline personality 23-year-old, an uncle who had murdered somebody. You know, this is a communication problem. So we talked about the case and, you know, generated a series of questions and lines of conversation and so forth. This was a long time ago when we used to work in that way. And I went into the room and I just went boop, right through the questions, never waiting, paying attention to the answer. I was so anxious. And all of a sudden there's a knock on the door, and I jumped up and ran out of the room, and there he is, and he says, what did you write your PhD dissertation on? And I said, how could you ask me that question right now? I'm dying in that room. Help me. What should I do? And he persisted, he persisted. So finally I said, you know, I studied therapeutic process, blah, blah, blah. How did you do that? And I gave him pushback again because I don't want to talk about this now. Finally I said, I interviewed families who were in therapy. I interviewed therapists. Did you feel comfortable doing that? I said, yes, I did. And he said, go back in that room and act like a researcher. So to me, that was, I was doing the performance of researcher was very familiar to me. But the performance of therapist was so beyond my repertoire, I thought. So I think we can do the same. Like what I'm trying to do when I work with people and when I talk about research is try to allow people to use the resources that are very familiar for them, the performances that they do comfortably. And think of that as a legitimate form of inquiry or research. Wow.
So.
I'm just struck by this story in many levels. One is how you bring the familiar in and introduce something that may be unfamiliar, which is the concept of research, and then make it research in that sense, which is find the familiarity in this thing that you're doing, but not seeing it as research. How can you do that? And the second thing that's striking me is crossing in the kind of the thresholds and the liminal spaces of these different worlds, and kind of it's not so much as crossing borders. It's about
bleeding borders, maybe.
Yeah,
is a better
bleeding,
word.
and also kind of in the thresholds. Like there's something being created there, where you are holding the both end. You're a therapist being a researcher.
Right.
But in this case, you were already a different kind of researcher than the one we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
How did that come about for you? I mean, how did you even do that or come to that? Because for him to say, just go be a researcher and interview.
I don't know. He's brilliant. He was brilliant. I mean, it really was. I never talked with him about where that came from. I think he knew me well enough to know where I felt comfortable and where I felt I was competent. And he just played on that. But I mean, it was a brilliant...
But you were already performing in different ways as a researcher, is what I'm kind of reading into that story, because some researchers will again be so stiff with their research questions.
That's true. Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, my background and my training would ensure that I would be a different kind of researcher from the get-go. Yeah, absolutely. But not to say comfortably so. I mean, comfortable in what I was doing, but if I had to then step into the social science world at a conference, then I would absolutely feel less than, which is, I think, what helps me write about inquiry in a different way, in a collaborative way, and work with people who want to be researchers, practitioners, doctoral students, who, you know, it gives me a lot of my own experience, my own life story gives me a lot of resources for helping, I think, people to really value what they do well and think of that in terms of research.
And does that come back from this place that you again bleed at the borders of, like, you don't think, oh, this is not professional life, this is my professional life. You don't keep them apart, but you allow it to shape or inform each other.
Very much so, but you know, I didn't come to that immediately. That came with years. But you know, if we could do anything for, like, raising children, you know, if I could take my undergraduate students that I teach and help them to not compartmentalize their lives and this is how I need to be here, but to see the creativity and the innovation that comes from kind of standing in the threshold, lead those to, I think, you said it before a minute ago, that one of the most useful things we can do is use what's familiar to us in a context that's unfamiliar to us, or in a context that might also be familiar to us, but acting this way in that context wouldn't make sense. So using the familiar in an unfamiliar way. I don't think we need to teach people how to do new things. I think we need to encourage people to use the resources they have for being relationally engaged with others.
Which may be a topic that might totally throw you off, but I'm going to throw it into the mix. It's interesting because at my university at Mercy College, we are playing big time with learning and e-portfolios, and bringing this notion of a reflective practice to learning. But it's coming from a very cognitive model of learning, which is these are cognitive processes. And you may be familiar or not, because I had kind of heard about it, but I've been reading more about it, the Bloom's taxonomy of which places knowledge, so it's a pyramid, which places knowledge as a threshold, and it creates all of this whole thing about knowledge, attitude, skill, training on this Bloom's taxonomy. And what's interesting is at the topmost is something known as reflecting and synthesis. So I'm writing a paper on this, and one of my people I'm talking to right now in the paper saying, I have to send this to Sheila. What will Sheila say? Because I think we have created reflecting as a cognitive activity. And this meta-reflection. And so when we train students or people to come into the unfamiliar from their space of competency or from their place of knowing, in the Bloom space, the idea is that you train them about the knowledge and give them skills of training before they can synthesize. But I think as social constructionists, we are saying that they already have this. you can start them at the place of reflection, move them in, and move down the pyramid towards that. So you start from their reflection of their competency, which I think is not yet happening in education when they're talking about reflection and reflective learning practices.
Exactly. I completely agree with you. I mean, reflection is the pinnacle, and you need to do all these other things before you get there.
Yeah.
But if we were teaching young children, university students, to reflect, and when I ask a question of my students that invites them into reflection, you know, it's blank.
Yeah, because they're not being.
What do you mean? Why did I say that? Well, that's the right answer, isn't it, or something like that. So I agree. I think, and I saw it in my own social experiment of raising my son.
Yeah.
You know, that he is a very reflective person. And it started at a very young age, being able to see patterns and reflect on the patterns and reflect on alternatives to the patterns. That doesn't require advanced knowledge.
They're already doing it. It's part of their way of being, I suppose.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Go ahead. Sorry.
No,
so,
we train it out of people. I think so.
So how did you keep it alive in when you were raising your son? Was it something that you were conscious, present to it, doing it, or was it just you were playing with ideas and you were playing with your kid?
Yeah, I think it was just playing with, and the only conscious part was to engage with him always as a wise and knowing person. You know, not as oftentimes we treat children like, you won't understand.
Right.
If he asked a question, he got an answer. Poor thing. He got more detailed answers a lot of times than he needed. But what I've noticed is that has really, I don't know if that's generated, but he is very reflective, and I do see it also working with my students that once they get used to it, I do something. I have my students facilitate a full class, and years ago when I would have them do that, I would grade them. But for the past decade, I invite them into my office, and it's funny because I post this set of criteria of how they should be, and they aren't knowledge contentful things. They're more like, were you flexible as a facilitator? Can you think of an example of when you were? Were you asking conversational questions, questions that open the conversation?
They're already reflective questions you ask.
I post that. I give them the questions, but they never think about it. And so when they come after their facilitation, and I say, I'm just going to go through these questions I gave you, and I'm going to have you talk to each other, because they do it in pairs, and come up with a rating for yourselves. And they never anticipated that. And then they have to have a conversation and reflect on what they've done. So the next time they have to do it, they can do things differently because they've taken the time instead of just saying, oh, that was hard, or oh, I did a terrible job. They've really thought about how they created the conditions that might promote an open and full discussion among the class, and all sorts of things like that.
So now, because we're getting into teaching and learning, I'm thinking
crossing the border here.
Exactly. So that's what I'm saying. Do you think about it as crossing the border, or is it back to inquiry is an everyday activity? And I see this as another great example of how you're in the role of a teacher, but you are again doing inquiry. And inquiry, in this sense, is a reflective practice that helps them to become curious about themselves. And that goes back to that constitutive aspect of performance, which is then they are starting to see how they are performing, or not in the evaluative sense of performance, but in the way they're creating.
That their fingerprints are all over what happens in that facilitation, but it's not theirs alone, because it's their peers and my present. It's all of that, and so it invites them into that. And I don't see. I mean, that's exactly it. That if I were to think of myself as an educator, as a practitioner who is an educator, my practice as an educator is a form of inquiry, is a form of research. So
it's interesting. So, wow, I love that. I'll have to steal that one.
Oh, you can take it. You do it already.
I think I am, but I've never framed it that way. Like I'm thinking, I have to go do my annual report, right, for my activities for the year. and it's constantly how you're thinking about your pedagogy. But what I loved about what you said was you're positioning yourself as a practitioner, which is what I tend to say, that theory, research, practice, all are forms of practice.
Absolutely.
And you're saying the practice of teaching is an inquiry.
Right.
It's about...
Right. And also, I mean, what you raise, I think, an interesting point in the way we talk about theory.
Yeah.
You know, that as if it's some abstraction, which for most people it is, and many theories are. Mm-hmm. But the beauty of social construction is it really is a practical theory. Mm-hmm. It's a way of living. And so again, we cross the border from here I am doing my academic work or my professional work, and then I go live my life. That, you know, so, you know, I can now legitimately call raising my son an experiment, right? Right. If I wanted to. And in fact, somebody once asked me, a colleague called me from, you know, he lived somewhere else in the country, and said, I've just been asked to serve on this committee. And I don't know if I should say yes. And I thought of you, and I thought, because you do a lot of things, and I wanted to know, how do you make a decision? I had never thought of that before. Usually my decision is okay, because I have a hard time saying no. You know, but as I thought about it, I said, you know, I think about everything I do, particularly committee work, as a living laboratory. For me to try to engage people in collaborative performances for change, because any university committee is allegedly about change, right? Trying to get a new policy, a new procedure, a new major, a new this or that. So, you know, I think that not saying, you know, that's my committee work and now I'm doing my research, but that becomes the place that actually my writing grows out of those experiences.
So is that what fuels your writing in terms of... Yeah,
there's always a very specific story behind everything I write.
I love your writing because you make the idea so accessible.
Oh, thank you.
I first read Therapy as Social Construction, and Jim Keller was our professor. He was retiring that year, and he said, do you want to read systems or do you want to read postmodern? And everybody said, oh, we've done systems in our masters, we want to do postmodern. And he brought out these books, and I was given Therapy as Social Construction. That's how I encountered it, and from that time, I've seen your writing. I mean, it's changed in terms of how.
Well, that was an edited volume anyway.
Right,
so,
right. Yeah. But it's always got this feeling like you're talking, and so this thing that it comes from a story, from something that drives you, is really neat. And I think it comes from the way you teach. It comes from like what I hear about students talking about any conversation they've had, and how the online program, some of them have had other conversations with you, and we've used a lot of your readings, or writings I should say, and one of the things was this notion of practice. And I think it was one of the more challenging conversation was theory, or this theory as a practical, or it is a form of practice. And I think just because we have these distinction that this is theory, it's very hard for folks to kind of cross that border and see this is practice.
It really is, and I mean, the bottom line, if we can talk about bottom lines, is, don't we want people to be using these ideas and living this way? And so to obfuscate them and make them so untouchable, unreachable, really does us all a disservice. And the other part is, I think it's an unfolding evolutionary story, because years ago, a couple decades ago, writing about social construction was near heresy. And so in order to get a place at the table, if you look at the earlier writings, they're pretty dogmatic.
So it was more written in the tradition of writing at that time.
Because you write to the audience. This is the audience I want to convince. So you think that this is not rigorous enough, this is not scientific enough. I mean, fill in the blank.
The form
so
of that.
So you take the form and you write it, and then, over time, constructionist ideas, I think, have really taken a place at the table. And depending on what community you're working in, they've taken over the table.
Yeah.
And now, the beauty, I mean, it's just so exciting, and I think your work is a perfect example of this, is the kind of loosening up and playing with the form. So, your writing is more poetic and has a playful quality.
I think of it more play and rather than poetic, because I think about yours and a couple of other folks who write in that way that is engaging in a different way without
and you really engage people with play, with and kind of can catch people like, oh, okay, I can start thinking that way, So but if it had been 30 years ago, you'd have a hard time with that kind of writing. So, and it's not only writing, but it's also the performative stuff you do. When you engage people, I've seen you teach. We've done workshop together, and the way you engage people, that becomes legitimate and necessary, I would say. And also then other forms of articulation, art, music, poetry.
Which brings me to the growing notion about performance, that it's different from how we've been talking about. It's getting into this aspect, which is it is more about evocative representation.
Yeah.
And again, there is the notion that, there's two aspects coming out. One aspect is this notion of write in a way that's engaging and evocative, so bring in art and poetry. And the other is that it is the science of, so there is the emphasis of, again, going back into this kind of a box and making something like art, theater, scientific.
Yeah.
And gaining that status.
Yeah.
But not talking about the constitutive part of it.
Yeah.
And at some level, I'm like, what needs to shift, or what needs to be more entered into this dialogue? Because I think the growing piece that I see from performance literature is more about the representational part being presented in there is no talk about the problem with the concept of representation. It is presented as theater. Let's write it as being more engaging, or write it as a script. But the concept that you are representing still remains.
Yeah.
So a part of me is like, what do we need to do to shift? And I'm hearing in your story of how you see what the form is, where the form is, and then over the course of engaging, something happens.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I love your use of the word evocative, because there are so many different ways to be evocative. And what I see, I think autoethnography comes immediately to mind, because people doing autoethnography often tend to be very creative. They're writing, it's almost like a novel, a piece of fiction, but it's not. It's about themselves. And I can't put my finger on it, but there's a lot of bad autoethnography, and there's a very narrow range of outstanding autoethnography. I know what makes the outstanding. It's that it is someone's story, but as you're reading it or engaging with it, however, because oftentimes it's mixed media, you have a new way of thinking about the world or some aspect of the world.
Some shift happens or something, yeah.
Whereas bad autoethnography leaves one saying, okay, so you had this experience, so what? So it's writing about your own experience in a way that invites others in, so that they can take something from it to transform their own lives.
That's the criteria you just...
Yeah.
Because I am on TQR's editorial board, and I get autoethnographies, and I'm constantly reading about what criteria people are evolving for this very thing, which is, how should it be written? Is this good enough for publication? Well, it's a good story, but it's not got something
that extra
that needs,
piece.
Yeah.
What's it offering?
Right. And I think it's still very much open as to what what the criteria need to
Yeah.
be.
And I think it goes back to your question also about these other forms that are more what we think of classically as more performative. That are those performances inviting others into this, back to the reflective space, so that some kind of transformation can occur, whether small or large, whether personal or relational or cultural or community-wise, or does the performance seem to be only about itself as a performance? And I think that that's the difference between the sort of performances representing something versus it's that engaged quality.
And it's generating something. It's not just speaking, but it's actually creating something. And we could pause there. It seems like a nice place to pause, unless there are any other thoughts.
No, good conversation. We could have gone in 50 different directions.
We could have, And I think we touched upon all the little different implications of it.
Yeah.
Could use it for our research workshops.
Let's do it. Let's just make them watch that, and then we'll go have coffee.